Hi, everyone. I would like to thank ISCA for the organization of this wonderful conference. It's helped us to talk about Cultic group, Cultic organization, and make connections. So thank you very much.
It did.
I'm Marie-Andrée Pelland. I'm a criminology professor, and today I'm with my master degree student, Céleste Goguen.
Hi, I'm Céleste. I'm a master's student in social sciences at the University of Moncton, and Marie-Andrée is my director.
Today, we will talk about institutional silence on sexual violence. We will analyze their strategy used to keep silence those sexual violence. The objective is really to analyze different public inquiries report that aim to analyze sexual abuse in religious organization, university, sports organization, and cultic group, to identify institutional strategies used to keep victims silent and to keep sexual abuse hidden for the public at large. What we all also want to know is those organizations, such as the Catholic Church, is it different from cultic groups, that we learn here, what we know? So today we will look at data that talk about prevalence of sexual violence in those organizations. We will define sexual violence. We will present our methodology result, and we'll discuss it. When we think about the prevalence of sexual victimization, most of the first inquiry talk about sexual violence in the Catholic Church. The first report started in the 1990s, but the most important one that put a number to the phenomenon is the John Jay College study published in 2004. At that time, it showed us that between 1950 and 2002, 4% of the priests in the United States has committed act of sexual abuse. Pennsylvania did also research a great inquiry in 2018 and identified 301 priests who were accused of sexually abusing more than 1,000 children in 6 dioceses of Pennsylvania. So we cannot deny that the phenomenon exists in some organization. Leader, powerful representative use sexual violence against other members. This phenomenon was also observed in Ireland. So the Fern Commission in 2005 reported more than 100 complaints of child sexual abuse that were made between 1966 and 2005 by 21 priests. After that, the Ryan Commission in 2009 identified 102 priests between 1975 and 2004 and identified 4,392 cases of sexual abuse by priests. Belgium also recognized more than 327 complaints by men and 161 by women that recognized to have been abused by religious authorities. So that exists, and that continue to it. What we see, for example, in the Catholic Church, is that usually the study cover 1950 to 2020, for example, and they all say that it started to slow down the number of abuse starting in 1990. But what they say is between 1990 and 2020, there are still cases of abuse. They are less in number, but they are still there. They are still present. So the Catholic Church still doesn't protect enough the children within the organization. Netherlands recognized 1,097 victims of sexual victimization. We talked about, I'm repeating in Pennsylvania, sorry, but Australia did a Royal Commission inquiry, and they recognized that it was more than the John Jay College study. 7% of the priests there abused children between 1950 and 2009. What was interesting with their inquiry is that they recognized that the abuse was more important in number and in gravity when children were placed in institutions, such as residential school or hospital, for example. France just only came up with the SIAZ report or the Sauvé report, and they studied the sexual victimization between 1950 and 2020. They came up with a horrifying number of victims. They heard a testimony, but they also analyzed data that came from the church, and they identified 216,000 victims of sexual abuse by cleric or religious figure. So it was not always the priest. That could be someone who was a authority figure within the church. That wasn't always the priest, but an horrifying number of victims also.
Very.
Cultic group, it's more difficult when you look at the phenomenon in cultic group. Australia did a case study on Jehovah's Witnesses. In their Royal inquiry, they recognized that the organization does not have a practice of reporting child sexual abuse to police or any other authorities. The organization has limited and ineffective risk management practice. So even the Australia report was only based on 2 testimony of victims from Jehovah's Witnesses, but they still recognize that the organization didn't encourage victims to go to the outside world to make a complaint, to seek services. Actually, in Belgium, there has been a committee that have been created to inquire the sexual treatment of minors within Jehovah's Witnesses organization. But we still don't have answer on that question. The report isn't out yet, so we are still waiting for it. In Canada, the Supreme Court of British Columbia studied the sexual abuse and other forms of victimization in the polygamous Mormon community called Bountiful. They recognized that 12 girls were determined to have been victims of sexual abuse within the community, mostly because most of them married between the age of 12 and 15 years old. And they also recognized that women were at higher risk of experiencing sexual abuse. What we know, public inquiry that study a situation in cultic group are really rare. Mm-hmm. It's almost the exception. Mm-hmm. We can ask why. It's because it's difficult to access the data. It's not often that, like in Nexium, there's an ex-member that come out and bring up some data. So it's really difficult to make an inquiry, to collect proof. They did it in the Mormon community in British Columbia. They seized information in the Jane Blackmore Health Center, but they couldn't come up with any kind of accusation. So to do inquiry, police investigation in a cultic group is really difficult. That's maybe why we don't have so much public inquiry into them. But if we compare, there are other organizations.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So like you kind of talked about, what's interesting is that not all cultic groups are like Nexium, where there's a whistleblower or there's a situation where there's able to have a lot of proof given. However, what we found is that when it comes to whistleblowers and mainstream media, situations with sports and youth organizations oftentimes do have people who kind of speak out a lot of the cases when it comes to criminal cases for the sexual abuse situations and inquiries that soon follow, public inquiries that follow because of that. So, for example, there's the USA Gymnastics, which had over 368 victims from mostly, a lot of the times is from Larry Nassar himself, and with 52 other coaches, which a lot of them kind of perpetuated that silence, that organizational silence to hide, essentially to make, to hide Larry Nassar behind them, to not allow whistleblowers to happen, essentially, but it happened anyways. In the case of the Scouts of America, there was a study that found 1,151 scouts that reported being abused by their leaders during a 19-year period. And that period was before the implementation of a youth protection plan, but it's kind of implied that the reason that plan kind of happened implied that the implement stems from the fact that those individuals talked about their abuse situation. Again, it's kind of covering up for themselves, essentially. Same can be said with the Penn State situation with the assistant football coach, Jerry Sandusky. Jerry Sandusky was found, had 45 counts of child sexual abuse involving 10 boys from his youth charity, the Second Mile. Penn State University also settled with Sandusky and the abuse claims by at least 35 people. So all of these situations kind of exude to the fact that these individuals were able to hide behind their organizations through different measures, whether it's with a plan that was set in place, whether it's with other coaches, whether it's a settlement. Either way, they were all hidden. So what is the definition of sexual violence? Well, Kelly kind of defines it as sexual violence does not necessarily only involve, as the term kind of suggests. The term is not only limited to sexual violence in a physical form, which is kind of implied with the term, but is also sexual touching, sexual harassment. Sexual violence in cyberspace, sexual violence in cyberspace can happen through producing or distribution of child pornography, whether that's downloading or sending or producing or putting it online, whatever that may be. It is child pornography and it's sexual violence in that term. It's something that is constantly growing, and the law courts kind of haven't followed along with it yet, essentially. It also implies sexual assault, and sexual microaggressions oftentimes happen, as it kind of suggests, it's a microaggression. It happens on the daily. It happens by verbal manners, by behavioral manners, by environmental things. Basically, it can be a constant touch. It can be a comment, what they deem as an innocent comment, because they've repeated it so many times that they view it as innocent, while anybody else looking from the outside in would not necessarily think it would be appropriate in those terms. So what Kelly speaks about when it comes to violent behaviors is that violent behaviors are oftentimes a continuum. What she means by that is that violent behaviors aren't necessarily linear. When it comes to linear violent behaviors, it doesn't necessarily persist, and it doesn't necessarily happen bigger and bigger and bigger, meaning it doesn't necessarily start with a microaggression and leads to sexual assault. It can go from a sexual assault, it can go from this and this, it varies. It's very important to keep that in mind. It does not necessarily mean that longer it goes for, the bigger the sexual violence happens. So it's also important that there is a distinction between the different forms of violence, and that the fact that those are not always clear in the experience. That kind of is explanatory. You can even use that in the terms of the microaggressions, meaning that for a person living through it, they don't necessarily acknowledge it. Sometimes it takes somebody from the outside to tell them that's not appropriate, that's not okay, for them to kind of realize the situation and then kind of begin to come to terms with it, which leads to the whole from acceptable to unacceptable, meaning, okay, I accepted it during that time because it was the right thing to do, or it was expected from me, or, oh, well, this individual does this to not only me, so it must be okay, to, okay, it's not acceptable. Same thing can kind of be said to the prevalence, meaning most to least experience. Just because you didn't experience sexual aggression, actual sexual assault does not mean it's not as important as you having sexual microaggressions or what may be. The impact remains the same. You can't minimize your situation, and it doesn't necessarily, the severity doesn't matter either. It's not a contest. It's not a contest. It's not who experienced something worse or not. So what is sexual violence? The definition for us, we very much used it on a feminist perspective, without having to go, but we'll go through it later. You can tell that the places where there are power relations oftentimes stems from patriarchal society situations, whether that's through cultic groups, whether that's through sports organizations, what may be. There's always this term of, oftentimes, the man is above everybody else. The most powerful man is above everybody else, and everybody kind of stems from that. For us, the perspective of having it be a feminist perspective leads to sexual violence being described as a way for it to deny specific women freedom and autonomy to be able to essentially live their lives. So as Kelly and Nussbaum point out, the man considers himself to have the legitimacy of continuous access to women's bodies and her sexual access, regardless of the means used to access it, be it by force, insistence, coercion, or aggression, which is oftentimes kind of, as we've seen in the examples, they do it because they can, what stems from it and their power of it.
And it's not only women, because it's the definition of Kelly. In our analysis, it can be the children. So people who are in a situation of be less powerful within those communities.
Exactly.
So we wanted to compare how these organizations maintain their silence before the scandal explodes in the media. So we collected 137 documents, public inquiry reports, sentence report, institutional reports as produced by child services or human rights organization. And so we did a data analysis. So we collected the team. We also identified the systematic response of these organizations. And we wanted to know how the offender reacted, how the victim reacted, and how the system, the church, the university, the sport organization, the cultic group reacted to maintain the abuse and the silence. And so how it allowed the victimization, but how also it allowed the silence to be kept on and on and on.
Exactly.
What all those organizations have is in common in one thing. First of all, it's even if it was written a long time ago, the routine activity theory for Goguen and Pelland, it speaks so much of the reality of these groups.
Yeah.
It's wonderful, but at the same time, it's a bit frightful.
Just a little bit.
What these organizations did is that they were really it's attracted a lot of offenders within these organizations, such as the Catholic Church. Because why? Because in these organizations, there were a lot of suitable targets. There were youth, there were young women who were free and where the men or powerful people could have a relationship with them. But also these targets or these youth were also not guarded by an adult, by the organization. So the priest, the sports coach, the leader could have a sexual relationship or could abuse the youth without even anyone to react to that situation. There weren't systems in place to protect the children within these organizations. Some of them had policies, but they weren't applied. So it was like there weren't any kind of protection for the children. We are also in a patriarchal institution where some men had more power than others, so they can use women as goods or children as goods. It's terrible to say that.
Absolutely.
But when you read the survey report from France, some priests use children to satisfy their needs. So, and nobody react to it, even when reports were made. And what facilitated that? It's because the priest, the leader, the sports coach, the doctor was idealized within the community, was seen as better, fantastic, that could help everyone reach wonderful status or situation or to reach God. So that helped to create a context where sexual abuse was possible.
So what we found in the results were that a lot of those patriarchal institutions found that they were essentially grooming the victim and the community at large. So what is grooming? So grooming is a process of manipulation and trust building that a perpetrator or a community will use to create an atmosphere where they can exploit a child or other members. And in the case of all these groups that we've named, all the institutions we've named, they always essentially have this. So in the case, we found that they oftentimes idealize or powerful figures within the group. So because this person was idolized, because this person had such a powerful presence within the group, it allowed them basically to do what they would, whatever they wanted to. They had basically a free pass, for lack of a better word. They were allowed contact with youth, a lot of the times youth that they shouldn't have contact with. They didn't have a proper reason to have contact with. Because they had that authority, that ideological look to them, their powerful presence, it allowed that behavior, anything that was deemed regularly inappropriate, to kind of fall under the radar. It allowed that the authorities didn't ask any questions, because if they were to fall under the radar, nobody would believe anybody, essentially, which is kind of the next point. I don't know if you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I would like that really.
Go.
It's not only the outside society that see, but also within the group, we allow the person to have contact with the youth. I will give you an example. One youth in one report said, my mother allowed the priest to bring me to my room and to show me to sleep. So the sexual abuse was made when the mother was at the first floor and the child in his room in the second floor each Sunday. So people didn't think that the priest, because of his position, could abuse. It's the same thing with Larry Nassar. They didn't think that he's a doctor, he helped my daughter. So they didn't think he could abuse them. So they allowed the contact with the youth without even questioning what he could do to them.
Exactly. And I think that also stems from the impact of what it gives to the victims, because if they were allowed to do that within the group itself, the impact, the victims didn't feel comfortable in speaking, because to them, who would believe them when they have a idolized person to look after that kind of got that free pass? What was going to happen? Nothing. So why would they talk? Essentially what stems from it. The same thing can be said when oftentimes if they were to talk about a sexual abuse allegation, a lot of the times the aggressor was going to be believed rather than the victim. Oftentimes, so it would demoralize that victim. What was the point of an individual talking, a victim talking, if nobody was going to believe them? So also, we found that grooming stems from filling a need. So it fills a need for the victim and the community. It confirms idealizations, and it causes special treatment that only they can give. Meaning, it kind of justifies, and I use justifies in quotations, of course, it justifies the means to have that one-on-one time. To have that, oh, we're going to go in a room and talk. Oh, if you use the case of Larry Nassar, oh, well, you have knee pain. All right, let's go, and I'll try to massage your knees and try to help you with your pain, when in reality, something else would come out, and it was for his need, not the individual's need, not the victim's need. It was a selfish move.
For sure, but what we have to see is that he created it as a way that, no, I'm fulfilling your need of the victim. I will give her a place on the team. I will give her access to resources in a religious group. I will give you access to education. So it's what the aggressor or the offender try to do is, I will give the youth something, so he won't talk about the abuse because I gave him something.
Yes.
Or either he won't even describe the relationship as abusive because of what I can give him or her.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And same can be said about the normalization of sexual behaviors. When it comes to cultic groups, we found that that's where it kind of leads off to, especially when it comes to relationships being with a certain individual within a group, which is kind of this extreme age gap, essentially, not only within the age gap, but the age of consent, which is whatever, but the extreme age gap in itself is inappropriate. But that group allows for a normalization of it. Now, it varies from cultic group or whatever may be as their reasoning behind it, of course. But for some, that sexual behavior is just allowed. It's as simple as that. It's allowed. It's allowed with children, and they do not deem it as wrong. We as individuals looking out deem it as wrong, but not everybody else does that. And it creates this special relationship because this person has, this bond with the leader or somebody more powerful than that can be excused, essentially. So there's also the side of rationalization, which is that, as it says, at this point, adult sexual behaviors aren't defined as abuse within the group. So some of it is medical procedures, communications with God, sadly, whether that's probing, situations like that where it can be justified, rationalized that no, this is happening, but you're taking it as a sexual means when it supposedly has no sexual meaning behind it, when in reality it does.
Yeah, that's mean also that the victim doesn't see the situation as abusive. So it's only when she will quit the group, she will be in contact with non-member, that she can have a process where she will recognize the behavior as abusive. As we had seen in some organization, when you talk together about the situation, they won't define, even if they feel wrong about it, they won't define it as a problem because the group sees this as a normal behavior. Even in some, such as the children of God, and it's an expected behavior between young and adult.
Yes. So they also times minimize that sexual violence, meaning if an individual, the aggressor, is caring towards children, it means they kind of have this ideal look to them. Oh, they carry themselves so well around children. Every children loves them. This idea that, they're this perfect person that children look up to. There's no way that what they do behind the scenes, behind closed doors, is right. There's no way that happens. And that kind of happens with gaslighting, meaning they oftentimes will say the victim doesn't know what she's talking about. No, she's interpreting it wrong. There's no way it happens, because even if they say what happens, their experience, she must be wrong. That's what they're stemming at, which comes from also denial. Denial is a very big thing. It stems from they cannot act without proof. And for a lot of times, sexual violence does not necessarily have the proof. It doesn't. It doesn't necessarily have bruises or anything of that nature. So oftentimes they're not going to report it to the proper authorities, because what are the proper authorities are going to do, especially if they minimize sexual violence of that means. Yeah. Go ahead.
These 6 things that we, such as idealization, feeling any, normalization, rationalization, minimization, denial, it's all 6 processes that are used either by the aggressor or by the community to maintain the silence of the victim and to keep the secret within the group.
Yes, exactly.
But sometimes the group want to be proactive. They want to show that they are doing something. So they will put an internal process together.
Yes, so they say. But
yes, so they say.
But the reality is that stems to, that further pushes the institutionalized violence, whereas that violence, that silence, protects the abuser.
Yeah.
So from the very beginning, the victim is oftentimes discouraged from filing a complaint. So whether that may be through blackmail, threats, verbal warnings, whatever may be, oftentimes, or sometimes it's a compensation, or let's settle this before it goes to court. Let's settle this before it goes public, because they want to avoid that extra layer of things. So that's what deterring the filing of complaints outside the group kind of stems from. It's to assure that the individual stays within the organization, within the group, within the institution, so nothing comes out of it. No whistleblower moment would happen. Biased complaint process, that's kind of the same thing. It kind of goes with what we previously said, whether that's minimizing situations, minimizing an individual, essentially not believing the victim. It protects the abuser.
But what it means also is that the group put together a complaint process.
Yes.
But the idea is that the victim is always lose when she put her complaint together. She will never win from that process.
Yes, exactly. And because of that, the burden of proof is difficult to reach. That's how it kind of amplifies into what it turns out to be. If they have a biased complaint process, if the committee or what may be already doesn't believe the individual, the process kind of remains the same. And it happens even with the Jehovah's Witness, where it's the two witness rules. Well, two people can't be wrong and two people can't be right. So whether you believe one person or another, oftentimes in those situations, the abuser will oftentimes be, how can I put this, a little bit above the victim. And because of that, they oftentimes believe the abuser. It's a question of status, as the slide says. If an individual has a higher status in the Jehovah's Witness or whatever it may be, they're going to believe that person because of the way the structure isn't within the group.
It's also because the two witness rules, it's rare that there are three persons in the room where sexual abuse happens. So the victim will say a thing, and the person who is alleged to have committed sexual abuse will say another thing. So the victim always loses.
Exactly. And for them, it's easy in that case. It makes things much simpler for them, but it also discourages the victim from further pushing along with it. Another side of it is also victim responsibility. Victim responsibility is a big situation. It's also very prevalent in normal regards, not only in institutions, in organizations, what may be. It is viewed as always being the victim's fault. Yeah. What we mean by that is that, how was she dressed? Was she dressed provocatively? Did she ask for it? That's oftentimes a big one. What did she say? Did she try to tease him? Did she look for that? Was she asking for it?
Yes.
What was she wearing? Was often a big one. What, she not always seemingly coming from a side of it's the victim's fault. It's never the aggressor's fault. Same can be said with purity culture. Purity culture stems from this perfect idea that the woman is a virgin, is a perfect virgin. Well, purity culture, if something like this were to happen, well, she lost her virginity. She's not this pure, idolized situation, even if it's an aggression, even if it's a sexual assault, essentially. And the whole process, this often stems and makes way for the group itself to forgive the abuser, whatever that may be. So a lot of times it's through public confession, a letter, a meeting one-on-one, a treatment facility, what may be. And oftentimes it's to say, no, we looked into it. It's kind of their way of accepting his behavior as being, okay, we've acknowledged it and we're going to fix it through means of a public confession, public apology, what may be.
For sure, yeah. So the organizations often actively protect the offender.
Big time. Big time. Oftentimes what happens is the organizations kind of do it, I don't want to say secretively, but kind of secretively.
Yeah.
We found that relocation was oftentimes a very big situation, especially with Catholic priests a lot of the times. They sent them to other communities, and other communities didn't have necessarily a way to communicate within other communities. So to them, this individual just kind of, we needed a priest. The priest is here, without looking at the background.
But it was the same case with Scout, yes. And it was also the case with USA Gymnastic, where coaches were sent in another city. Yep. So it's kind of an unusual practice that Yes,
A little
for
bit.
all the group, all the group that we've seen.
Just a little bit. Also, there was a lot of talks about sending the aggressor for facility treatments. But what was interesting is that those facility treatments were, I don't want to say a ruse because it's not necessarily a ruse, but they kind of justified in that they would find something else to fall back on. To say, for example, oh, I have an alcohol problem, and the alcohol problem explains my sexual desires, so to speak.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, let's take you to a facility treatment for the alcoholism rather than the sexual abuse. So at the base of it all, they're continuing that institutionalized silence by avoiding the main issue at hand. Also, community resources were available mostly to the aggressor. Same kind of thing. If this individual were to have looked into helping, or, oh, I'm going to do community service to better myself, oftentimes it reinforced that idea of the ideal person, this, oh, they can do no wrong, they're proving themselves, as opposed to trying to help the victim, which would have much more needed those resources in coping with their situations rather than helping the aggressor. Also, the victim can be threatened. It can also, it's very prevalent that the organization sometimes victim blames. The organization can also stem from testimonies to their group, meaning that if they talk about this, it's going to ruin a group or organization's reputation. What stems from it being perfect, ideal, oh no, if you talk about this, everybody will know it's not perfect, basically.
We also seen that some organization will actively tell the victim, oh, it's strange, you are the only person who reported it. So maybe it's not true. So it put a doubt in the mind of the victim.
Yes.
But what also helped kept the silence of the victim, it's because usually within the group, their denunciation wasn't received well, wasn't believed, first in their family and after in the community at large. Mm-hmm. So that the consequence of that is that the victims self-blame themselves. They say, oh no, it's my fault, I'm responsible for it. They felt shame about the abuse, fear that it will ruin their life, or that it will ruin the life of their brother, sister, parents within the community. Mm-hmm. So that can them from talking to other, from going to outside the groups. So they accepted their silence to protect the other within their family or within the community. They accepted to be silent because they wanted to be a good member, a good sister, a good brother. Mm-hmm. But also they often felt the lack of confidence for the authority because mm-hmm. they reported the crime to someone and the authority within the group didn't believe them. So why the police of the outside world would believe it?
Exactly.
So, and the consequences of all that, they felt extremely alone in the world with their secret. So that's part why all these processes reinforce the silence of the victim. Mm-hmm. When you look at all the group that we read, all the data, for me, it's surprising, but also not surprising at all. Yeah. How the knowledge built by the cult research, all the research on coercive control, manipulation, help us to understand the processes of these groups and how they arrived to keep the silence for 20, 30, 40, 50 years before the secret come out. Mm-hmm. And often it take from some organization, some newspaper, 2-3 years before they have enough data to publish. So it takes a lot of power from another organization to bring out the secret. Why? Because of the coercive control within the community. The Catholic Church, University with their sports team, Scout America, USA Gymnastic, all had a culture where the victim had no control on their life. All of their everyday movement was dictated by the sports, by the group, by their religious beliefs. So they couldn't freely consent to their situation. They couldn't made a realistic choice based on knowledge. Their agencies was taken out by the group and by all the subtle form of coercive control. And it was the same in gymnastic, USA Gymnastic, in Jehovah's Witnesses report or the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to attain your goal, such as to be an Olympic champion or to be accepted in God's paradise, you had to accept the treatment within the group. That was your price.
Yeah.
So even the theory from Lalish with the bounded choice or the bike model help us to understand in ways these organizations control the member to keep their silence. So they control what their behavior, the information they had access to. For example, in some group, it was okay to talk about it within the group, to make a complaint, and after that it was dealt with. So they didn't have to go outside. So even some member didn't know that they could go outside to report the abuse. Mm-hmm. They also control the way they thought about the experience. So for some example, we saw that for some, it was only a normal experience. Mm-hmm. It was normal that a 12-year-old girl marry a 76 man, or children had sex with adults. That was a normal way to communicate with God.
It was justified.
Justify it. It's terrible to say that, but it's no way that allowed to control the people within the group and to allow sexual abuse to go on and on and on and on.
Exactly.
And they also control the way the victim talk about their experiences, but also the way they felt about it. Mm-hmm. They had to feel responsible for the abuse. They must have provoked the offenders.
Yeah.
It's terrible what we talk about and the processes that we identify in those in each of these reports. But what we have to learn is that the reality of cultic group when sexual abuse are present is not different than for other organizations. They use the same processes to allow the sexual abuse to go on.
Exactly.
But okay, the question is, what can we do to prevent those kind of abuse to continue? Or what if an organization want to change the situation? They have to put processes in place. Bluden, 2021, did a research based on the report in Australia. And she said that the organization must put together a meaningful apology. Not an apology done before because the media talk about it and it's a crisis management excuse. They must mean it. And that's difficult to come upon.
It most definitely is.
And they should put together a process of accountability and transparency. So they should open their book to show which priest, which person allegation were made against, what kind of process was put together, was it credible, to, after that, say, okay, we will put new processes in place. This is how we will do it. This is how we will repair it. So they must be transparent in their actions.
Mhm.
Catholic Church hasn't reached that that goal yet.
Nope.
They put processes in place, but because there are no process of verification, there's no obligation from churches. There's a diminution of, there are less sexual abuse, but there are still some. So there are still work to be done.
A lot.
But we also have to put together in our respective countries actions such as the justice system can put accusation in place toward people who actively keep secret. Even if they don't have participated in sexual abuse, people who kept the silence must be responsible. So we must put charge against them. We must also, as a collectivity, oblige cultic group, religious organization to put together clear guideline and obligation when an allegation is made, and we must oblige them to be accountable. So each year they must submit a report. They can have some kind of evaluation from an outside firm. So we must put clear guideline in place. Why is that? Because we need to put this type of strategy in place to repair all of the consequences made to the victim. Because they weren't believe in their family, we must rebuild their self-confidence. So we must put in place some kind of organization that would help them to rebuild their relationship with member of their families. We must put together more appropriate legal action to rebuild their self-respect, so the law can recognize what they experience and will punish the aggressor, the offender. And also, as a community, we need to show them solidarity. We need them to recognize them as survivors of sexual abuse. We need to hear them and to believe them in a social space. So in that way, we can repair that. Also, us as a community, we sometimes kept the silence, or sometimes we didn't want to see. So that's a way of repairing the victimization. Thank you, and we look forward to your question.
Yes, thank you.